All right, so I decided to do this today instead of just diving into the Yom Kippur presentation because I feel like a lot of my interpretations of things ultimately stem from a different way of thinking, and I wanted to kind of outline this different way of thinking, um, so that everyone else can kind of be on the same page. So let's see, we'll start with this piece here. All right, and I'm just going to talk through what I think is going on in the world in general, and starting with creation and how it's outlined in the Bible. Um, and then we're going to build into like the methodology on how to think about things that I use. This doesn't mean that everyone has to think this way. It just means that this is the way I do it. And I found that it leads to me not having any kind of cognitive dissonance or like problems where two things seem to disagree with each other, but I hold those beliefs simultaneously. And I can end up being very clear about the things that I understand and how I communicate them to others. So I think what is going on in the Bible, and I'm using John 1 as an example, where the very first verse, John 1 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Um, I think this is a great example of how to think abstractly. And I think what John is getting at here is that God is an abstract concept. And so is this notion of the word. Now, word in Hebrew, the word davar, could mean concept as well. If you think about it, any word is a kind of concept. So humans, we may say the word house here. And what that is it's an utterance, right? We form some sound waves and project them out to somebody's ear, or we write them down and etch them into some kind of medium so that we get these letters. Either way, we've created a label and we're pointing to something in reality, right? In this case, it's a category of types of entities that we would encounter in reality. So there's always a word which is separate from the thing that it is denoting. The word is a kind of information artifact which labels something in reality. So you have reality and all the stuff in it, and then you have the words and what they point to in reality. So the John 1 diagram up at the top here is that we both have God, which is an entity represented by this blue circle, and we have a word, or the concept of entity, is over here. And then we have a relationship with. So we know that this word, the entity, whatever this is with God. So they're two separate things. That's part of what's being said here. But also it says the word was God. So the word is indistinguishable from God. I try to keep in mind as part of my framework of interpretation here that ancient people did not have the same level of understanding that we do. And so therefore they did not have the same vocabulary in order to denote the distinguishment that we've noticed. So in the beginning, right, Bereshit, the very first set of events which happened in existence, everything was indistinguishable. We had all of the stuff that was needed in order to end up with everything you see around us, you and me and chickens and irons and whatever else. All the matter to create that was already there. It says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That was the first thing that happened, is that all the stuff came into existence. But as we know from modern cosmology and Big Bang theory, everything was indistinguished from each other right after the Big Bang. We just have a ton of matter, and it's all very close to each other, very high, but there's no space in between it. And the first thing God said is Yehi Or, which means let there be light, which is essentially like all of the radiation was already there and being projected out, but there was no space in between the stuff for the light to be emit into. The first thing that happened was space or separation or distinguishment was created so that there was now vacuum or areas for the light radiation to travel into. And that's the first thing that happened, is God started a process where he would continue to distinguish entities in reality over time until we end up with the full variety of everything you see here. You see, these are all the animals, right? So even when God said, let the ground bring forth the animals of all of their kinds, he kicked off a process whereby we would get an insane variety of different kinds of animals. Um, we see the results of that today. So at each level, things are starting to become more distinguished from each other, more separate and more clearly defined. And that's what's going on um, with the Bible. So that's part of the interpretive framework. That's what we see in reality, is we see distinguishment between entities, and we need different words to describe the different things we see, so that when we communicate, people can understand what we're not talking about. If I say house, for example, like, hey, check out that house, and you look out the window and you see trees and you see someone walking their dog and you see a skateboard and you see a street and you see cars, you know, I'm not talking about any of that stuff. You can focus on what appears to be the house, which is then what I'm talking about. So labels and words help us distinguish between entities and reality so that we all can be on the same page with what we're talking about. And the entire process of God laying all of these things out for us in the universe is a process in which he's distinguishing entities from one another with different characteristics, and then ultimately leading up to us with whom he wants to have a relationship, and then also use the word of God or the concepts of God to label spiritual concepts for us to understand how one is different than another, how one action is different than another, and how one outcome or one emotional experience is different from another, and how to try to manipulate that to our advantage by bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth. So we have this notion that God inside of his head, much like if this is an architect, this is Sally, the architect down here, right? She's imagining, hey, I'd sure like a house to live in, right? And so in her mind, immediately are the blueprints for the house. It's the design for the house. So the house, in a sense, already exists now that she's designed it in her mind, right? She's like, I'm going to put this foundation here. It's going to have these dimensions, and I'm going to put the support beams up, and yada yada yada. So she's got a design in her mind. All of that information exists now, right? And if Sally dies, but she already told Steve the exact design, well, now the house still exists. It can still be put on a blueprint, and a construction team could ultimately realize this house, and it would be the exact same house, assuming they use the exact same blueprint or exact same information. So this is abstractly what's happening, that we have an abstract realm inside our thoughts, inside our mind, or in eternity. The Hebrew conceptualization of this is eternity. It is the abstract realm. The information exists for eternity. If Sally tells Steve, who tells his son, who tells his son, this house could live forever, because the information needed to completely reconstruct it is always being perfectly transmit between people. And at any given time, they can spend the resources to create that exact house. So the word of God, the concepts of God, which is all that was created, including you and me, existed since the beginning. And the ordination, right, of the life, birth, death, resurrection of Jesus, that's what's being alluded to in John 1, was thought of from the beginning. It was part of the blueprints or the design of all of creation. And so that idea, that concept, that design, that information, whatever you want to call it, was inside of the mind of God, so to speak. So it was God. God himself couldn't point to anything else that existed other than God and all of his internal thoughts and processes. At some point, though, that abstract information was put into a sort of design blueprint or information artifact that would document, here's all the details on how I'm going to create physics and chemistry and matter and all these things, and set apart all the processes that are going to go about and lead to the ultimate purpose of reality that I desire. So that's John, in my opinion, trying to get at this notion of an eternal or an abstract concept. It's both inside of God's mind, just like thoughts are inside of us, or thoughts are part of us, indistinguishable from us. And words, thoughts, information is also a separate thing. You can see here, we think of it, and then we also create artifacts that are represented by it, or we label artifacts we see that are labeled by information. It's very abstract. It's difficult to get your head around. And I think that's why it's so hard for people to interpret what John is talking about. So he was with God in the beginning, right? Jesus, this abstract concept, right? That God, whatever attributes he has, and we'll see how I define attributes in a second, was there from the beginning. and through him all things were made. Right? With him nothing was made that has been, or without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of all mankind. So light is clearly seeing the distinguishment between things. In the dark, all you see is black. You can't distinguish. Right? So this is all about distinguishment. Right? And how Jesus was part of the plan of distinguishment, that whatever God is and his attributes are can both be manifest in human form. It can exist in the abstract realm with no human interaction other than our thoughts and communication, or something else. So that is kind of the basic framework for understanding. So I'm going to introduce a concept of ontology, or formal knowledge diagram. This comes from my practice of building ontologies as digital artifacts for information systems for my job. This is a way of organizing information or meaning so that computers can understand it and take actions. And the benefit of doing things this way, even if you're not a programmer or a data modeling kind of person for your job, is that because this is a format that computers can deal with, it means they're very specific. If you get one thing wrong with the computer, it just won't work at all when it comes to computer programming. If you miss like a semicolon or some character, your whole program that you want to build just won't work. So it's very important when you're dealing with computers, you get everything 100% right. As humans, when we think, we often gloss over things, and I'll show you some examples of that in a second, where we're not being very clear about what concepts we're talking about, exactly what distinguishes them from one another, and how they relate to one another in a very specific way. Building a formal knowledge diagram like this is a way to start to become more explicit and clear about exactly what it is you're talking about, and therefore it will increase your understanding. Whether you like it or not, a process like this one is going on inside of your mind. And this begins from a very young age. It underpins how humans learn. As part of the motivation for how to create these ontologies is by boiling down all of the meaning that we deal with into its kind of atomic elements, the most fundamental units of knowledge and information. So here's an example of a diagram called a taxonomy. A taxonomy is an organizational structure where the entities that you're modeling are categories of things or types, and those are the circles here in blue. And then you have relationships or lines, and these arrows here, if they're a subtype of relationship, so anytime you go down, you get more specialized versions of whatever you have that are more general at the top. So this taxonomy here would be like a simple biological taxonomy. There are kinds of things in reality that have spines. Of those kinds of things, they can be mammals, which would be things maybe which have fur and give birth to live young. Or they could be reptiles. And again, this is simplification, it doesn't include all of reality, but it's just here for you to get the point. If they have scales and are cold-blooded, right, perhaps they're a reptile. And you can distinguish one from the other. And so whatever you're dealing with in reality is either a kind of this, or a kind of this, or a kind of something else, but it can't be both types. And that's part of the power of a taxonomy, is it helps you distinguish, so that now that you're talking about a mammal, you can't possibly be talking about that snake over there or that turtle over there. This helps us distinguish between kinds of entities we encounter in life. Everything is a category, or is an instance of a category that is in a universal taxonomy that describes all things and how they're related to each other. The process of building that universal taxonomy is kind of step one in understanding. So when you identify a concept like God, you have to figure out what kind of thing is God. Is God a kind of sentient being, right? Is it actually some creature with a physical form? Is it an abstract concept, right? Like mathematics or language or number theory, right? So is God just this collection of attributes that exists abstractly that has no physical form? What kind of entity is this? Are there subtypes of it? Or is this a super category at the top that's very general? Thinking about what kind of thing this is and where it fits into the universal taxonomy is the first step of building a formal knowledge diagram. For each thing, each category in your knowledge diagram, that you introduce, if you say, oh, cat, that's a type of thing we see in reality. It is a subtype of mammal, right? And dog is a kind of thing. It is a subtype of mammal. If you introduce subtypes, there has to be only one path to the top. So you're forced to define what distinguishes between all the other things in reality that let you know you have a cat versus a dog, for example. If you have something which barks and has fur and gives birth to live young and is warm-blooded and such, then it's a dog, right? If you have something that meows, maybe it's a cat. And so that's your definition. That's what distinguishes it. You're free to try to come up with whatever distinguishment attributes you want, but that's the process, is you need to make sure you're partitioning your reality as you understand it into different buckets that you can't possibly have something that's both a dog and a cat at the same time. If that ever comes up, you need to change your model so that it becomes more clear. You have to be able to distinguish clearly between different types of things. And if you have a type, if what you're talking about is a type and it goes in the taxonomy, then you have to have attributes that distinguish. You can have other relationships, which this purple arrow here is a relationship called chases that I just introduced to say dogs and cats relate because dogs are known to chase cats. We'll get into other kinds of relationships in a second, but I wanted to focus on the types. So there must be one path to the top for all instances, and you have to think about what the functional attributes are. What is it that distinguishes this thing from other things? What are the qualities or the attributes that a kind or this kind of entity must have? Without it, you don't possibly have it. Like a dog has to have DNA, which is dog DNA, right? If you see something and you pull out the DNA and you analyze it and it's cat DNA, then even if it looks like a dog, it must be a cat. So think about what it is that makes that type of thing, Here are the most common types going from the very, very top. So in the beginning, this entity here, this is the root of all things. Everything is an instance of an entity, whether it is a quality like the color orange or like the mass of an object, whether it is an information artifact like a word or this ontology, whether it's an organizational principle like a company you may start, or like a set of principles or something like that, a process, a location, an object. They're all kinds of entities, and we can label them uniformly in this way. The common ones are types of physical objects, either things which can be located. This is most of the entities we encounter. They're physical. They take up space, and you can locate them at a point in time. Or it's a location, like a region of space that you're talking about that's really physically there. If it's not spatio-temporal, right, it's over here. But if it's not locatable in space, but it is locatable in time, it would be a process. So this would be like the process of your life unfolding, the process of a heartbeat, the ongoing process of creation, or the process of you buying a chicken sandwich from Chick-fil-A. Temporal entities like events or processes are a very common type. So when you're trying to denote this in an ontology, you may have an instance of a process or a thing. It gets tricky when you're dealing with abstract concepts. Organization is a formal organizational concept. So it's whenever a human comes up with a word for one or more things that they want to label as a unit, you can introduce a notion of an emergent property. There's a fancy term for quality of a group of objects, right, that exhibit some trait or some quality. So whenever we see that kind of thing happen, humans created a word for it in order to organize those abstract concepts into a group. So whenever we label things abstractly like that, we're kind of organizing information against some kind of abstract heading or concept. If we want to create a new term to represent the set of activities that I'm going to perform to help kids learn how to run faster, then I might create a business, and I'll just come up with a name, and I'll call it Thunderbolts Speed School, right? And so now I have this organization. This is an actual like human organization, just a subtype of organization, where my term that I use, I'm going to instantiate as some kind of company, right, according to the legal jurisdiction I'm in. Most of what we deal with assumes roles. A role is a realizable entity, like a student, a teacher, or an employee, where you are not a student, right? And this is one of the main areas of cognitive problems that we introduce as humans when we don't think clearly. You are not a student you can assume the role of student for a period of time. Right? When you enroll in classes, you may assume the role of student. When you graduate, you then unassume that role. You can be a student, so to speak, for a point in time. But it is not correct that you are a student in the sense that you're an instance of the type student, right? And that's a tricky one for people to get. There are types which, once you are one of those kinds of things, once you are one of these types, you will always have been that type. So you are a human, right? You are not an old person. You are not a child, right? Those are roles that are functions of where you are in your life cycle, right? You are not a student. You are not an employee. You are not an idiot. You are not a Christian. If you make a commitment to follow the tenets of Christianity or follow the teaching of Jesus, when you do so, you assume the role of follower of Christ. But at any given time, you can choose to get off of that path and go do things that are not what Christ would do. So then you take that role off and you put another one on. You could call that like hell child or something. I don't know. But this concept of role where you realize it or you assume it for a point in time, and then you abandon it at another point in time is really key to unlocking lots of the topics we encounter in reality. Qualities are attributes, like the color of your hair, your age. They can be measurable, they can be subjective, like emotions and other such things. But that is the main set of types you will encounter in reality, and these are types. There are a lot of things which are actually roles, right? So there would be subtypes of role, but then the relationship between you, which is ultimately some kind of human, which is a subtype of object, because humans can be located in space and time, you might have an arrow to a particular kind of role to say that you assume that role. And we'll kind of see that sort of thing in a second. So here's another diagram that kind of shows you the challenges we have when we model things incorrectly in this way. So if you have a process, which is in this case, maybe something that has a time span, it has a causal agent, some entity that starts it. It may unfold over a location for a period of time. And it has a patient, one or more, which is essentially something which experiences the consequence of your process. Kind of process might be a human life cycle, and you might have another one called existence. And existence is what existed in the beginning. In the beginning, this concept of existence and space-time and the earth and Chick-fil-A and all these other things was all thought about. And the process of all of that unfolding would be called existence. The matter, right, that it was made out of, you can call matter, right? And those are two separate concepts. So if you start to detail that out here, you might build up a nice taxonomy of types that will allow you to understand reality a little bit better. Then over here, maybe you have a person, which is defined by the possession of human DNA, right? Not get into the details of how to analyze that for that, but assuming it can be done in a lab, you can know whether or not an entity is a person or not by doing a DNA test. But then let's say you start to model things, but you don't understand the difference between roles and types. You're going to say a child is a subtype of person and so is a student. But now suddenly we have multiple paths to the top, because if I'm a kindergarten student, I'm both a child and a student, and now we have a problem. What I'm talking about must not be a type. It must be some other kind of entity. And it turns out I've already given you the answer ahead of time. These would be roles, because for a point in time, I can be a child and a student, and I can also be a teacher while I'm a student, right? If you have roles, you're free to assume multiple roles, even at the same time. And that's perfectly fine, according to this line of thinking. But remember, with types, you only have one path to the top. In general, what's happening is concepts are more universal, and then concepts go down on lower levels of abstraction towards, more specific concepts. But then also, all of the concepts in your taxonomy are categories. They're types of things, right? The actual entities you encounter are instances or specific instances of things. So if we have this type here, human, we have the ability to assume the student and child role to kind of clarify the question mark diagram on the last slide. We could have a specific instance and say Jeremy is an instance of the human type. Jeremy assumed the role of student on September 1st, 1988. Jeremy unassumed the role of student on November 1st, 2005. The role of child, January 14th, 1984, and unassumed that role All of these statements are facts to the best of our knowledge. We're trying to be as clear about building a database of facts in our mind that once you assert them and once you believe them, there's never a point in time where they're not true. Whereas if I said Jeremy is a student, but I didn't really qualify it by saying I assumed the role on a particular date, then that fact may only be true while I'm a student. I've now introduced a supposed fact into my mind, but then after this date, it wasn't correct anymore, right? So the goal of building these ontologies is to end up with a database of facts that once you believe it, it can never change. It will always be the case that this statement is true, right? Once it's true, I document that fact. It's always true from that point on. Jeremy is always an instance of the human type. I may not be in the life cycle phase of actually having a body which is alive, but Jeremy is always an instance of the human type. And much like the architect in the first slide, God, the architect of all, has all of the information required to create me again, including all of the history I went through and all the choices that led up to me as a person. If somebody's writing down all that information somewhere and it's transmitting it through time, then they always have the opportunity to recreate me from scratch. And in which case, it's still the case that I'm an instance of the human type, just in an abstract realm, even though I don't possess a body. So we're going to switch to a spiritual concept now, and I'm going to gloss over some of the details just to illustrate what's going on. But this notion of consecration or setting holy is a great example of how to apply what I'm talking about with distinguishment into kind of practical interpretation framework for interpreting the Bible. The word consecrate is set apart. Kadosh in Hebrew just means to set apart. So if you have animals walking through a gate and you count them, the first one, the second one, the third one, right? Every 10th one gets set apart for a special purpose. If you get a paycheck and you need to pay taxes, part of your paycheck, whether you like it or not, is getting set apart for the purposes of going to the government to fund all of the wonderful things that the government does. So that is the notion of consecration. It is distinguishment. It is setting apart entities intended for one purpose from the entities which are intended for another purpose. So you now have a plan. You instantiate a process whereby you're intending to fulfill a purpose, and you set apart or you distinguish entities to be designated for that purpose. So that's what God's talking about, in my opinion, when he's talking about things that are holy. We have some weird notion of like radiant, magical beams coming from the sky and angels singing, and like it's almost like we believe holiness just means magical, right? Like supernatural. I don't think that's what it's talking about. That's not grounded in reality. I think what it means is it's actually talking about distinguishment, right? Which is the same exact thing that God did with creation, is he set things apart. So some are distinguishable from others. Some have different roles than others. And with Sabbath, excuse me, with Sabbath, it's a day which is set apart for the purpose of recovery. So you have 6 days to do all kinds of work, to set processes in place, to build and labor and put energy into maintaining and curating and starting processes and manifesting a reality. But then one day you need to let whatever processes you've kicked off just do their thing for a day, including your own body. Right? You can work out, you can tear it down, you can do whatever, but if you don't take time off, your body will never recover. Or if you don't take time off from work, you're going to get burnt out. If you don't take time off from anything that you do, you're going to get burnt out, or it's not going to benefit from a recovery process. So you need to distinguish between normal time and recovery time, just like it's distinguished between day and night, and week 1 from week 2. There's distinguishment between all these things, and Shabbat, which is a Sabbath day, was introduced to distinguish between time to do things, to build up and to put in energy, and times to recover and benefit from and relax. And so here are most of the relevant verses pertaining to Shabbat. And if we try to synthesize all of this information to try to build a knowledge diagram, we might end up with something that starts like this. The weekly Shabbat is a kind of appointed time, right? Which in Hebrew is moed, which is a kind of recurring process. So it happens on a recurring basis according to our calendar. which is a kind of process, right? So we have this subtype, right? So some days are instances of Shabbat, like last Friday night to Saturday night, for example, which would have been what, August 30th or something. That would have been a specific instance of this type of entity, right? According to this type hierarchy. Humans, right? Instances of humans are called to defend Shabbat. The word shomer, which keep, is like a castle keep, a fortification, or you put a fortification around this because life itself is going to mount up a lot of energy and try its best to destroy your dedication to this concept. There's always something that comes up, and this is true for everybody. It's always like, oh, I need you to go ahead and come in for work on Saturday, right? Or if you're keeping your Shabbat on Sunday, because of your traditional history, then it's going to be Sunday. Whatever you dedicate to do, it's going to be attacked by the processes that are in place. It's going to make it hard for you to put in the energy to distinguish it. You're called to defend the process of setting that apart for recovery. And the way in which you do it is outlined here. It's a day of sacred assembly. So it's a day where you get apart, or you get away from kind of normal day-to-day stuff, and you get together with other people who are committed likewise in order to gather together with one another. It is a day to rest like God rests, or recover from the actual work of facilitating these high energy processes to create new things and to add on and to create value. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread. So this is when the Israelites were in the wilderness and they were gathering manna, which is like that magical bread or whatever. God gave them bread for 2 days on the sixth day so that they would have some left over. So they didn't need to leave their house and go facilitate the process of gathering what they needed to survive. They should have already done that preparation ahead of time so that they could recover. So he's telling us to think ahead, plan ahead as part of the defense of this structure, so that we can make sure we recover. And as much as possible, we're trying to prevent something popping up that's a necessity we forgot that's going to cause us to not recover. So this one is just part of this concept or context that the manna was like coriander seed, right? Coriander seed is a very hard little ball. So it wasn't that there was this fluffy bread just sitting around. The process that's being described here is God gave them this seed, and they had to pound it right down into some kind of flour and mix it and bake it and whatever else they had to do. There's a process of work that needed to be put in to make it edible. So what God is saying is like, don't go continue those processes that you need to survive. You should have the bread already ready to go, because you should have prepared it the day before. Don't light a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. So you should already have your fire going. You should just need to keep a log on it, stoke it a little bit, but minimize the amount of work you have to do so that you can maximize recovery, right? And why? Because you were a slave in Egypt. You were compelled to do things, right, that you didn't want to do. Now that you're in control and you can design your time how you want, right? Remember, the reality is you were rescued. You were delivered because of work that was done for you. And you are commanded to sit back and relax for a day and recover and let God be God and let the processes and the work you've done pay dividends to you. So this is an example of gathering all of the attributes. This is what makes an instance of the weekly Shabbat different from all other days, is because you're dedicated to doing these things, which are different than what you would just normally do on any other day. And again, this is how you start to organize those thoughts in your mind. And that's really the overview of the ontology. And this is how I think about the Torah. And what this is going to lead into for the next couple talks are kind of the fundamental framework of understanding. And then we'll ultimately go through some examples from the Bible that allow us to apply this framework to see how it leads to different practical interpretations than if you had just read through it and just thought whatever you happened to think at the time. If you have a more systematic way of understanding it, then what you're essentially doing is you're trying to regularize the way God speaks to you. You're allowing him to speak to you by putting through the work to try to decode what he's saying, rather than just, letting the chips fall where they may. So hopefully this is useful to everybody watching. And that's all I got for today. All right, bye. All right, cool.